Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon with Hebrew Voices, and I am here today with Charles Heller. He is the media coordinator for an organization called Jews for the Preservation of Firearm Ownership. He's also a co-founder and the communications coordinator of the Arizona Citizens Defense League. Shalom, Charles.
Shalom.
It's great to have you on the Hebrew Voices program, Charles. You're Jewish, is that correct?
That is correct. Both sides of the family, and I was bar mitzvah in 1970 at B'nai Jacob, if you're looking for my bona fides.
Okay.
My bar mitzvah fides, as the case may be.
Okay. So I have you on the line today. I wanted to do this program for some time, and recently there was this just horrific shooting, this mass shooting, the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. 60 people were killed, this shooting in Las Vegas. And I actually had spoken to you about a year ago about doing this program and never really was able to get to it. And now I thought now is the time to do it. And what I wanted to talk about is this whole issue of gun control and the connection that your organization, Jews for the Preservation of Firearm Ownership, has established, which really blew my mind when I saw this, that there is a pattern in history of a connection between gun control and genocide. And the most famous example, perhaps, or really the clearest one, is that the Jews in 1938, there was a law passed in Nazi Germany forbidding Jews from having guns.
It's called the Nazi Weapons Act, yes. What it did was it made it easier to murder Jews. At that point, they had no clue what Hitler had in mind. And we are a law-abiding people, as you well know, and your listeners know. That's why so many of us choose the legal profession. We have a tendency to be obsessive about complying with the letter of certain laws. And we are, as compliant people, if the law of the land at the time said to register guns, they would have registered their guns.
Well, and then that registry, the Nazi gun registry, which actually started in the Weimar Republic before the Nazis, that was then used to establish which Jews had guns and which didn't, and to confiscate the guns from the Jews.
Well, what happened was that the laws were changed in the 1930s, and it's in Stephen Halbrook's book, excellent book on the topic, is called Gun Control in the Third Reich. Disarming the Jews and Enemies of the State. And I've interviewed him. I'm also a talk show host, and I had him on my program Liberty Watch and America Armed and Free for 90 minutes. And it was a very, very good interview. Hal Brooks, an excellent guest.
Now, your organization put out a video, No Guns for Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And in the video, what they explain is that one day after Kristallnacht in 1938, what was originally the Weimar 1928 Firearms and Ammunition Control Act, which required the registration of guns, that it was amended to prohibit Jews from having weapons. And the rabbinical director of your organization, Rabbi David Ben-Dori, he says in that video, and quote, "If Jews had not turned in their firearms, if Jews had not registered their guns in Hitler's registry, things would have been different." And he's not saying that the Holocaust wouldn't have happened, but it might not have been so easy for them to round up the Jews and kill them. And to put that in perspective, it wasn't just the Jews of Germany. So during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis sent in what they called the Einsatzgruppen, the special units, and they killed 1.5 million Jews in that operation alone. And those Jews weren't allowed to have guns because they were living under the gun confiscation of the Soviet Union. So it was a double whammy. It wasn't just the Jews in Germany, it was the Jews in the Soviet Union as well.
Mm-hmm.
So also quoting from your video, No Guns for Jews, in the video you guys said, prior to writing the bill, and by the way, this is referring to the U.S. Federal Gun Control Act of 1968, which was initiated by Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut. So in the video, you explain, prior to writing the bill on July 2nd, 1968, Senator Thomas Dodd requested a translation of the 1938 Nazi weapons law from the Library of Congress. A comparison of the language in the final bill shows some of it was copied word for word from the same laws the Nazis used in 1938, the same laws that were approved by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party.
Dodd's father had been a prosecutor at Nuremberg, and that's how he became aware of it. And that's the chain of custody, if you will, of how it came to the United States.
And you guys found, no pun intended, the smoking gun, which is the document in which he requisitioned the translation of this Nazi Firearms Act in order to incorporate verbiage and concepts into the U.S. 1968 Gun Control Act. And we're living under the regime of essentially something descended from the Nazi Firearm Act today in the United States.
That's true. It was in our book called Lethal Laws. I mean, it actually has a photograph of the document in the book.
And you show that in the video, too, a photo of this document from Senator Thomas Dodd.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that there are superficial similarities. We know there's actually a direct connection from the Nazi Firearm Act to the U.S. Federal Gun Control Act of 1968.
The 68 GCA, we call it. Yeah, there absolutely is a direct line. But, vicious statism has a lot in common, no matter whether it's Nazi or communist or, the people who wish to wreck freedom have a lot in common.
Explain what statism is. I think a lot of the listeners don't know what it is.
Statism is the idea that the state runs things, that the state is supreme. Either the state is supreme or that you're endowed by your creator with unalienable rights. One or the other is true. And in America, we believe that you're endowed by your creator with inalienable rights, or unalienable rights as the case may be. And statists believe that your rights come from the state. Let me give you just a very brief example. I interviewed the great historian G. Edward Griffin on my program, and he said that statists believe that your rights are software installed by the government, and freedomists believe that your rights are hardware installed by your creator.
Well, and the point is that if the state gives you a privilege, it can take away the privilege. A state can try to deny you rights, but they actually can't take away your rights because they're given to you by God.
Supposedly not without due process of law, which I believe is in the Constitution.
Let me give a little bit of background for this interview so people understand where I'm coming from here. So I started spending a lot of time in Texas a few years ago, and I befriended this police officer in the DFW area. And he said to me one day, he says, "What kind of gun do you have, Nehemia?" I said, "Gun? I don't have a gun. I grew up in Chicago. The only people I knew who had guns were gangbangers and drug dealers, and the police, of course." And I said to him, "I don't have a gun." And he said to me, and this is a quote, he says, "If you're a Jew in Texas without a gun, then you're a stupid Jew." And I thought, wow, okay, a policeman told me this. And I don't come from a line of people who had guns. And I'm going to ask you in a minute to share your background, because I think you come from a very different background in relation to guns. Well, that was what I call my first witness. And then my second witness, Charles, was I was in Israel during the knife intifada, but a couple years ago we had this spate of attacks where they're just knifing Jews every day. And I would literally be having conversations with people. I'd be going to meet a friend at a cafe, and my friend would say, "Well, what are you carrying?" And I would literally be carrying in my pocket a small hammer. And my friend would be carrying like a kitchen knife and things. And because that's all we had. Because in Israel, we don't actually have the right to bear arms. At least that's recognized by the government, which is kind of surprising to a lot of people. And these were functional things. I'm carrying a hammer because someone may come with a knife at me and attack me. And I don't have the ability to have a gun. Well, in the United States, I actually have that right to have a gun. And then there was an incident in 2015. Rabbi Menachem Margolin, he was one of the leading rabbis of the European Jews, and he's a rabbi in Belgium. And he wrote a letter to the European governments asking for Jews to be allowed to carry guns in order to defend themselves. And this is after anti-Semitic attacks in Europe have become rampant. And you had a situation where the police had openly said, for example, in France, there were these police who were Muslims who said, "We're not going to defend Jewish synagogues." And even when they were defending synagogues, the police can't be there 24/7. And so the rabbi was asking for permission for Jews to have guns to defend their synagogues. And he wasn't even talking about every Jew. He was talking about armed security guards, and they were denied that right. And it made me start to think, so when I'm in the United States, I have the right to bear arms, and I don't exercise that right. Maybe I should. And so I actually made it one of my goals to buy a gun, to be trained in how to use that gun, and to get a license to carry that gun in the state of Texas. And I've actually done that. And I'm actually the first person in the history of my family, Charles, in the history of my family, going back to King David, I'm the first person ever to own a gun of any kind. So tell us about your background and your introduction to guns.
Well, my dad came home from World War II with a .45, and when I got old enough to be curious, he moved it out of our apartment and left it at my grandfather's house. And once a week on Saturday, when we go to visit my grandfather, he would take out the .45 if I was behaving myself. He'd show me how it worked, and he'd make sure I left it pointed in a safe direction, not at people. It was a real gun, and of course, there was no ammo present. And when I got to about 6.5 or 7 or so, he showed me how it came apart and went together. He says, "When you can do that by yourself, you can shoot it." And then he left the room, took the ammo, and left me with the gun, disassembled. I went on a 6-year project or 7-year project to figure out how that bleep thing went back together again. Well, if he'd have showed me one trick that I've known for a long time now, I could have put it together when I was 6. But no, he wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to show me how to assemble the top and then slide it on and just hold up on the spring so that it didn't pop out. And then I could have just put it against the table, pushed down on the handle of the gun while the front sight was buried against the table, and then put the pin in it while that was happening. If he'd have showed me how to do that, I could have done it at 7. But he did it the smart way. He showed me how it worked, and every time I asked him, he'd take it apart and put it together again, and then he'd leave it disassembled, laying on the bed where I slept when I stayed over at my grandfather's house. And one day, I was about I think it was about 11. I figured out how it went together. I sat there and I left very frustrated, sweating. And actually, some of my first experiences with profanity came with trying to put that gun together.
And for our younger listeners, Charles, this is before the advent of Google and YouTube, because today you'd figure it out in 5 minutes by watching a YouTube video, but back then you had to figure it out yourself.
So I figured out how to put it together, and then I stuck the gun back in. There was a blue zipper bag that he had. I put it in this, and it was in a brown paper bag inside the blue bag, so I left it assembled, and I said, "Hey, Dad, can I play with a gun?" And he said, "Sure," and he stuck his hand in there for a bag of parts and came out with an assembled 45. And he said, "Hey, what happened here?" Actually, he uttered one of the first times I'd ever heard him use it. And, what the fun? And there was an assembled 45 in there. He goes, "I got it." And he says, "Show me." And it took me 15 or 20 minutes of sweating to get it done, but I actually put it together again. He goes, "When you want to go shoot it?" I said, "How about for my birthday?" So my birthday was up and coming for I think it was my 11th birthday. And we went over to Bell's, and that thing made music so sweet, I've never lost a tune.
And what is Bell's? You went to Bell's? What's that?
Bell's Gun Range. That was back when Ma Bell still owned it. Ma Bell was the little old lady that started the place. Illinois, it hates guns. And so they eventually ran it out of business, and the neighboring police department engineered their losing their FFL so they couldn't sell guns.
Now, that's the federal firearms license?
Right, yeah. They couldn't sell guns there anymore, but they still had the range. So, and then eventually it went downhill and downhill and downhill. And finally they closed, and the place has been bulldozed. It's something else now. It's a shame, but a lot of us fired our first shots there. So anyway, I grew up and finished high school and some college. And then I got a job opportunity to move out to Arizona. And in Chicago, you could own a handgun as long as it was registered. Well, the scam was, okay, here's my registration. Oh, we don't accept those. But wait.
What?
That was how Chicago worked. From 1978 until it changed in 2008, the scam was you could own any handgun you wanted as long as it was registered. So attempt to register a gun and not be a police officer or a security guard or a court official or a politician. And the answer was, we don't accept those. And so that's what the McDonald lawsuit in 2010 was all about.
So you're actually legitimately a firearms refugee from Illinois, from Chicago.
Yeah, I'm a political refugee for the right to keep and bear arms. I would have stayed in Chicago. If it had been legal to register a gun and I could have legally owned a gun, I would have stayed in Chicago. But what they did was they made me unwelcome. They made me unwelcome by disliking the way I dress, which is going armed. And if I couldn't do that legally, I wasn't going to give Illinois or Chicago any of my tax money because they had disqualified themselves from my participation by outlawing what at the time was my hobby and is now part of my profession. I'm a state-certified concealed weapons instructor, and I teach a mighty fine class on the laws on the use of force and self-defense and some of the physical aspects, the basics, not a gunfighting school, but the basics in how to an armed self-defense. I teach that, and it's part of my living. It's part of my livelihood, and I figured out a way to make my hobby into part of my profession.
Now, you live currently in Arizona, and you're a co-founder of the Arizona Citizens Defense League. And I want people to know what that is and to look that up. That was the organization that was the main push behind Arizona getting constitutional carry. So this is actually a really important organization that you're a co-founder of.
Right. Constitutional carry was our flagship, but we've had 58 good bills signed by 3 different governors.
In the video that you guys have, it's really an amazing video. I'm going to put a link to it on my website, nehemiaswall.com, No Guns for Jews. And there's a line there that's really powerful. Rabbi Ben-Dori, he says, self-preservation is a God-given right, as described in the Torah. And then he says, contrary to God's law, many Jewish politicians and influential Jewish leaders promote gun control measures that take away that right. And I want to talk about those Jewish politicians and leaders who are against guns, who are in favor of gun control in a minute. But before that, this being Hebrew Voices, I want to just bring a few passages from the Torah. You actually bring these in the video. First one is Leviticus 19:16, and it says, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, you shall not stand by the blood of your neighbor or your fellow. And what that means is if you see someone being physically harmed and their blood being spilled, you're required by the Torah to intervene and get involved to try to save that person.
Right. It's no different than if someone is drowning. You're not going to stand there and watch them drown, and you're not going to stand there and watch them be assaulted. It's evil to say that you should stand there. I mean, what are you, in line to be eaten by the Morlocks?
Oh, that's a reference to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Okay. Anyway, the other passage is Exodus 22, verses 2-3, which in Hebrew is verses 1-2. It's speaking about a thief breaking into your house. It says if the thief is found in a tunnel and is smitten and dies, there is no blood guilt. And what that means is that if someone's breaking into your house and there's a reasonable expectation this person is going to use violence against you, if he's caught and you kill him, you're actually allowed to do that. And in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin 72a and Yoma 85b, there's a famous phrase in Hebrew, Haba lehol gacha hashkem lehol go, which is, he who comes to kill you, rise up first and kill him. And they base it on that passage in Exodus 22, that if someone's breaking into your house, if he's breaking in at night through a tunnel or some other means, he knows that if he's caught, that you're going to defend your property. And so he's coming in with the thought that, okay, I'm going to use deadly force. And even though you can't read his mind, his actions show that he's willing to use deadly force, and therefore you are allowed to defend yourself with deadly force. And then we have an example of that. We call that in Hebrew din rodef, the law of the pursuer, which is derived from 2 Samuel 2, 19 to 23. That's the story of Abner and Asael, where this man named Asael is chasing Abner. And he only wants to really take Abner's cloak. He doesn't even want to kill him. And Abner warns him. He says, if you come after me, I'm going to have to defend myself. And he keeps coming and he kills him. So this idea of what we learned from Scripture, from the Tanakh, from the Bible, is really a contrast to the principles that seem to be espoused by leftists in America, by what you call the statists, these Jewish statists. And I want you to talk about that a little bit. Why is it that you have these Jewish politicians, prominent Jewish politicians and leaders, who are against guns, who want to establish gun control? I mean, it's this paradox.
They're not against guns, they're against rights. Let's be clear. Because a gun has no rights in and of itself. It's the person. Only a natural person can have rights. And the problem is that the religion of the Jewish statists is not Judaism. Their religion is socialism. Their religion is statism. So as a result, what they've done is they've forsaken God and they've embraced the religion of collectiveness. They've embraced a collective philosophy as opposed to embracing their Jewish roots. It's a shame. I see people like that and it makes me want to rend my clothes and say that we've lost a soul because they're clearly not following God. Who are they following? In all their actions, they trust the individual to decide for themselves. And that's really what the issue is here. It's, do we obey the collective or do we respect the individual? And that's the problem. You see, God's law respects the individual choice that if someone comes after him, and if in his reasonable judgment, someone is coming in a tunnel into your house or someone is breaking in the door at night, God trusts the judgment of the Jew to defend himself. But Schumer doesn't. So either God is wrong or Schumer, I'll let you pick who. The idea that you're not trustable to make decisions for yourself that's the statist thing. The whole idea, whether it's that with guns or whether it's Bloomberg with 32-ounce sodas or any number of other things that you have to first get permission from the state before you exercise your right. The Supreme Court, if you read the Heller decision, has said that the right to keep and bear arms is a basic individual right on par with free speech and any other basic constitutional right. The Heller decision was Dick Heller, and he was a special police officer for Washington, D.C. He carries a gun for work, and the government told him the D.C. law said that he couldn't have a gun in his house. So, it's not that he's not qualified. It's not that he's not trained, but because he doesn't have government permission, he can't have a gun in his house for self-defense. And that because he's not a member of some militia. Well, what the Heller decision said is that a private ownership of a handgun in your home is not conditional upon malicious service, and it's a basic individual fundamental right, and the city of D.C. cannot abridge, they can't burden your right to such an extent that you can't exercise. They may regulate it, but they can't regulate it out of existence.
I started to explain before what got me interested in your organization, and so I go to this class to get my, we call in Texas, LTC, license to carry, because I want to follow the law. Like you said, Jews are law-abiding. So I'm in this class, and the teacher's asking all the people, why do you want a gun? And there was interesting answers. And I told him it was the Dallas area police officer who had said to me, if you're a Jew in Texas without a gun, you're a stupid Jew. So he said to me, you should look into the Jews for the preservation of firearm ownership. They're better than the NRA. I said, what? No, Jews are against guns. I don't know what you're talking about. And I was, in fact, an hour before we started this discussion, I was talking to a friend and mentioned the story about, Jews having guns. And this person said, oh, no, Jews don't own guns. And so it was this paradox. It was almost an oxymoron. Jews for the preservation of firearm ownerships? No, Jews don't have guns. And in fact, what I find out from your organization, that Jews being stripped of guns was essentially, historically, a way of controlling Jews and persecuting Jews. And one of the things you guys talk about on your website is a historical connection between genocides in the 20th century and gun control.
Yeah, there's a very good movie called Innocence Betrayed that we did a number of years ago. It's a landmark piece of work. It's been quoted in a lot of places, but it shows how the precursor to a lot of genocides was the disarmament of the population. And it goes through 6 or 7 of them, of course, the Nazi one, but it also goes through the Armenian genocide, almost 25 years before World War II. And it goes through the genocide that Pol Pot engaged in. It goes in the genocide of Mao Zedong. It goes into genocides around the world. The Rwandan massacre is in there. It goes through a lot of times when in history when people have been disarmed by their governments. In fact, there's a term for it. It's called democide. Murder of the people. And more people in the 20th century were killed by their own governments than were ever killed in wars. And it's demonstrable. It's provable fact. And the precursor act in every single time there has been a democide is the disarmament of the public. And gun control for Jews is not new. I mean, throughout the centuries, sword control, when swords were the modern handgun of their day, and bows and arrows were the modern rifles of their day, and crossbows were the modern bump fire stocks of the day. I mean, you had these things that were the weapon of the day that many Jews were banned from having in times before guns were in vogue. So it's not like disarmament is new to guns. Disarmament, especially of the Jews, is something that's been going on for a very long time.
Jews should be the group that's more in favor of the right to bear arms than anybody else. And that's why when I found out about your organization, I said, I need to speak to these people. Jews for the preservation of firearm ownership. And yet many Jews in the United States are open, prominent advocates of gun control. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Right, but an equal number, or at least a significant number, are very pro-rights when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms. And the most prominent pro-rights, pro-self-defense people are Jews as well. For instance, the lawyer who's won landmark cases for this is a dual Israeli-American citizen raised in Israel, Alan Gura. Yeah, and the prime leadership guy on suing the living daylights out of jurisdictions that won't comply with the Constitution is Alan Gottlieb.
Who's Jewish. I mean, so you have Jews on both sides, yet for some reason...
You got significant heavyweight ones. You got David Koppel, who's a heavyweight guy in terms of rights. Koppel is an observant Jew who is an attorney and has been on a lot of these cases like Heller and McDonald and Madigan versus Roe in Illinois that got them concealed carry. A lot of these guys are Jewish. And I mean, the significant heavy-duty pro-rights people, a lot of them, probably one of the most outspoken, and he's an advisor to JPFO, and erudite spokesman for the right to keep and bear arms, is Alan Corwin, who's about as Jewish as it gets.
Wow. So I think the reason that a lot of people are against guns is they're actually afraid of guns. And I've heard this so many times. If you have a gun, you're more likely to shoot yourself than actually use it to defend yourself. And one of the statistics that you bring in the video, No Guns for Jews, is, and I quote, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, every day, 550 rapes and 1,100 murders are prevented just by the intended victim showing a gun. And that is a mind-boggling statistic. That's a huge number. How come we don't hear about this every time there's a shooting? Yes, it's horrible. 60 people were killed, but 1,100 people are alive today because they have a gun to defend themselves.
Because we don't have honest journalists who care about the facts. Unfortunately, many of whom are Jewish.
Wow. And I looked up on the Bureau of Justice Statistics website, and they have all these interesting studies from different periods. And I'll put a link to this on my website, nehemiahswall.com. From 2007 to 2011, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics of the United States, there were 235,700 victims of violent crime who defended themselves with a firearm. And that's an average of nearly 50,000 people per year that are defending themselves with firearms and not getting raped, not getting murdered because they have firearms. We're not told this when we hear about how evil guns are. And another statistic that has been going around is something that was tweeted by Ben Shapiro, and he shows a graph of the increase in firearm ownership versus the decrease in gun murders. And it's an inverse relationship. As the number of firearm ownership goes up, the percentage of murders is going down. So the way it's presented by statist Jews and the left-wing media is that guns are evil and people only die because of guns. But actually we're seeing that horrible murders and rapes are being prevented because of guns.
Right. I'll give you something else that you're starting to hear it in the media today. There's between 29 and 32,000 deaths a year attributed to guns. But of those, about 19,000 a year are suicide. Now, look, I'm not advocating for suicide, but the fact that someone does themselves in with a gun is a far different thing than a murderer who comes and steals your life from you. And almost 60% of the deaths by firearm are suicide, which means that in the United States, about 11,000 people kill someone with a gun. Of those 11,000, about 1,000 of them are justifiable police killings, and about 1,200 of them a year, more or less, are justifiable killings in self-defense. That brings the statistic down to about 9,000 murders with a gun in a year. Most of those are in 75 counties in the United States, largely populated counties, and most of those have either a drug or a gang affiliation. If you were to subtract the drug and gang affiliation away from the murders, there's probably about 5,000 a year. Now divide 5,000 by 330 million people in the country. We have a very low gun murder rate, and one of the lower among all the developed countries in the world.
And just in contrast, you mentioned suicide, so I looked this up. The country that has the highest suicide rate in the world, I was actually kind of surprised, it's actually Hungary. And Japan is number 2. And in both of those countries, you can't get guns. I mean, there's almost no guns in Japan. And Hungary, being a European country, has very tight gun control. And those two countries have the highest suicide rates. And when it comes to murders, Russia has 4 times the murder rate that we have. And in Russia, if you're a private citizen, you can't get a handgun.
I'll tell you another country, it's got 10 times our murder rates, Honduras. And they got tight gun control.
And you mentioned that a significant number of the gun murders in the United States are drug-related and gang-related. I got to wonder how many of those gang murders are carried out with legally purchased, licensed handguns. And so what ends up happening is the bad guys have the guns, and you end up preventing the private, law-abiding citizen from getting the gun. That's what gun control does.
Right. Exactly. Well, gun control is classically defined as the punishment of the innocent for the acts of the guilty. That's what gun control is.
So I want to bring something up here, and you have this wonderful article on Jews for the Preservation of Firearm Ownership. It's an article, and I'm going to link to it on nehemiahaswell.com on my website. And the article is called Why Jews Hate Guns. And it's a white paper that you guys put out by Rabbi David Ben-Dori. It's actually really profound. I want people to go and read it. But the number one reason he lists out of the 10 reasons why Jews hate guns is a desire for utopian moral purity. And I think really from the Jews I know, this is the number one motivating concept behind opposition to guns. You know, and look, we have this prophecy. It's Isaiah chapter 2, that when the Messiah comes, he'll bring peace to the world. People will beat their swords into plowshares. And the thought is, well, let's do that now. But we don't live in the world of the Messiah. We live in a fallen world where we have drug crimes and we have ISIS. Really, the number one thing that made me go out and buy a gun. And I mean, I mentioned a few of the things, but one of them was reading this book, because I really had that thought too, that we should live in a utopian world where we don't need to have guns. But we don't live in that world. And I was reading this book. It was called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Profound book that explains all kinds of things in history. And in the beginning of the book, he talks about the Chatham Islands, which are 500 miles east of New Zealand. And he describes how these islands were completely isolated. There was a tribe there called the Moriori, and they were related to the Maori who lived in New Zealand, but the two didn't know each other existed. I'm going to read a few quotes from this book, and you'll see where I'm coming from here. It's really profound. So he describes the isolation of these islands, and he says, with no other accessible islands, the Moriori had to learn how to get along with each other. They did so by renouncing war. The result was a small, unwarlike population with simple technology and weapons. And you hear this and you're like, it's literally an island paradise where there's no war. Everybody lives in peace. And he goes on. He says, in 1835, an Australian seal hunting ship brought the news to New Zealand of the islands, meaning they didn't know these islands existed. He explains the islands where the inhabitants are very numerous, but they do not understand how to fight and have no weapons. That news was enough to induce 900 Maori from New Zealand to sail to the Chatham Islands. On November 19, 1835, a ship carrying Maori armed with guns, clubs, and axes arrived. Groups of Maori began to walk through the Moriori settlements, announcing that the Moriori were now their slaves and killing those who objected. An organized resistance by the Moriori could still have then defeated the Maori, who were then outnumbered 2-1. However, the Moriori had a tradition of resolving disputes peacefully. They decided in a council meeting not to fight back, but to offer peace, friendship, and a division of resources. Over the course of the next few days, the Maori killed hundreds of Moriori, cooked and ate many of the bodies, and enslaved all the others. A Maori conqueror explained, quote, "We took possession in accordance with our customs and we caught all the people. Not one escaped. Some ran away from us. These we killed and others we killed. But what of that? It was in accordance with our custom. And so I read this around the same time that the Yazidi genocide was taking place. That was in northern Iraq, where ISIS was going through these areas with a group called the Yazidis. And they were committing genocide. They actually did exactly what the Maori had done 200 years earlier. They were slaughtering people and taking them as sex slaves. And it was around the same time that the Boko Haram had kidnapped 300 young girls from a boarding school in northern Nigeria. And I looked into this. Boko Haram means Western education is forbidden, meaning it's a Muslim terrorist organization in northern Nigeria that's in principle opposed to education. So it wasn't an accident that they attacked a school, meaning it was part of their platform. They were attacking schools for years. And what they would normally do is they'd slaughter all the boys and they sometimes let the girls go. Well, this time they took the girls as sex slaves. And the world was shocked. And I heard this and I was reading this thing about the Maori and the Moriori, and I thought, wait a minute, if they had been doing this for years, murdering people in these schools in Nigeria, how come every teacher in that school didn't have an AR-15? How come there was no security to protect those little girls? You know, I lived in Israel for decades, and in Israel, you can't even get into a school without going through an armed security guard. And there they had hundreds of little girls in a boarding school, and there was no one there to protect them. And then we're told that, well, having guns is evil. No, not having guns when you live in this world is evil. It's just evil. It's evil to leave people undefended and open to attack. If every Yazidi had an AR-15 or an AK-47, we wouldn't be reading about the Yazidi genocide.
Right. You know, Beviata Moshiach ani mamin.
Amen. May it be soon. The coming of the Messiah.
At the same time, until he or she arrives, maybe it'd be wise to protect your family?
Not just maybe. It's a moral imperative. I think that's what the lessons of history have taught us.
That was a Jewish maybe.
Okay, a Jewish maybe. This is the conclusion I've come to, that if you have the ability to have a firearm, then you need to have that firearm to protect you and your family and those around you. And if you don't, you're just opening yourself up to the next genocide and those around you to the next genocide. Look, it also has a deterrent effect of those people who prevent the rapes and the murders that we mentioned before. Most of those just show the gun to the person and no one ever gets shot. And that's enough to deter the rape or the murder. So let's talk about Las Vegas, because one of the arguments that people have made is that, you know, these bump stock devices they're a force multiplier. And so one person's able to kill 60 people. Instead of in the past, someone would go in with a knife and he'd kill a few people. And so what could have prevented this massacre in Las Vegas? What law could have prevented it?
Nothing. There is no law that would have prevented it. No amount of regulation is going to change what happened in Las Vegas last week. What could have prevented it was a few judiciously placed counter snipers on top of the buildings surrounding the venue. And once one of the counter snipers said, we have an active attack going on from the 32nd floor of a certain hotel. And he says, I can see where he's shooting. I can see him. I have him in my scope. Permission to fire. And then permission granted. And bam, he's done. Yeah, he'd have killed a few people, but he wouldn't have injured 500 and he wouldn't have killed 60 or 58, I believe, is the official total right now. But what I'm saying is yes, it could have been stopped and it wouldn't have taken much to do it. Now, agreed. People with licensed handguns at the venue were powerless to change what happened because where they were fired on from and what they were fired on with. But any one of them inside the venue, if they had an AR-15, could have certainly, or any other, I mean, even a bolt-action 30-06 could have easily enough shot back at the 32nd story. Whether or not they'd had a braced position from which to take a good shot is questionable. But certainly having a couple of snipers on the roof of every building around the venue is not an unreasonable thing to do. And the teams that are trained and lawfully able to do stuff like that already exist.
Right, and they do that. That's not a far-fetched thing. In other words, when they have 1 million people in Times Square for New Year's celebrations, they actually show you on the news the snipers that are on the roofs to protect people against this exact type of thing.
Right, exactly. This is not rocket science. This is not new. And what it's done is it's woken people up to the possibility of what can happen if they're in condition white, which is the mental state of liquid paper and not paying attention to the surroundings. You could see the people who were in condition yellow. There were the guy who found a truck with the keys in it and took people to the hospital, people using shirts and other things to tie a tourniquet around a limb to try and staunch the arterial blood flow. You can see people doing things like this that largely were military veterans that knew what to do in that circumstance, and I think saved a lot of lives doing it. This is why I don't go to entertainment venues for the most part. When I do, I sit in the back row, proximal to the door. If somebody ever comes in to do that, I have a firing angle, and I don't go anywhere where I'm a fusilla non grata, where the firearm isn't welcome.
I was at an event in Israel about a year ago, and you had to go through security. They checked to see if you had a weapon when you came in. And it was probably only 200-300 people there. It wasn't that large of an event. And there was a sniper on one of the roofs nearby in case something went wrong. And look, it costs money. There's no question about that. Do you devote resources to save lives? That's what it comes down to. And if you have an event with 22,000 people, it's actually hard for me to believe that they didn't have some kind of security like that. I guess that won't happen again, I'm assuming. Can you just give some last words, maybe some words of hope for people in America and around the world who are being subjected to gun control and really a witch hunt with this sort of moral panic?
Get a gun, learn to use it, and learn how to be situationally aware. There's a wonderful book. Would it be a Jewish interview without recommending a book?
Please.
There's a wonderful book by Colonel John Boyd, and it's his autobiography. But Boyd is the man who developed the concept called the OODA loop. OODA is OODA. It sounds kind of Hebrew, doesn't it?
It
but
does.
Anyway, but it's the OODA loop is observe, orient, decide, and act. And what it is it's constant vigilance. Some people would almost describe it to a point of hypervigilance. I don't. It's just constant vigilance and observing and constantly comparing the known to the unknown and looking for incongruities. And if you do that, you will see things that other people just do not see. That happens to me all the time. I notice stuff that other people just don't notice because they got their nose so far in their phone, it's coming out the other side. In fact, Apple's got a new case on the market. It's got a nose bulge in the back of the phone case.
Oh. Okay. Well, Charles, where can people find your information?
If they want to look at our organization, it's jpfo.org, Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, jpfo.org. And
you mentioned you have a radio program. Is that something people can listen to online?
You can listen live, or if you want to listen to the podcast, it's libertywatchradio.com. So libertywatchradio.com. Just look on the left side, go down to the recent shows tab, click the recent shows. The last 6 months of the program are there.
Wonderful. All right, Charles, thank you very much, and appreciate you coming and sharing with us.
Sei gesund.
All right, shalom.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.